In our first session, I offered a very basic introduction to apologetics. We tried to ask and answer the question, what is apologetics? In this second session, I want to turn our focus towards the method of apologetics. How do we do this? How do we do apologetics? And there's really two major methods of apologetics. One method is a content-based method. And there's several different ways of going about apologetics in a content-based method. The most common way is what's called an evidential method. An evidential method of apologetics is exactly what it sounds like. It's offering evidence for what we believe and why we believe it. So here's some evidence showing why it's reasonable to believe that God exists. Here's some evidence showing that Jesus did raise from the dead. That's really the most typical way of doing apologetics. We even see Jesus doing this type of apologetics in the Gospels. When people ask him to identify who he is, Jesus says, well, look at the miracles that I've done, or look at what was written about me in the Hebrew scriptures. That's kind of an evidential-based apologetics, and it's quite effective in a lot of circumstances. Another type of evidential apologetics is called a presuppositional. A presuppositional approach. A presuppositional approach is really aimed at showing why competing belief systems are not true, or why competing belief systems are not sufficient. That's what a presuppositional approach typically does. A good example of this in the Gospels is Jesus in Matthew chapter 7, where he talks about the wise builder and the foolish builder. And he says the wise builder, he builds his house on a rock, and it's strong and it's sturdy. The foolish builder, he builds his house on the sand, and it's susceptible to the storms, and it falters in the midst of the storms. And he's really showing how it's a flawed, your approach is flawed, your life is flawed if you build it on anything other than the truth of who Jesus is. And that's what a presuppositional approach to apologetics does. It looks at competing belief systems and says, here's why they're flawed. Here's why they're not sufficient. And then thirdly, you have what I call an experiential approach. An experiential approach is offering your testimony, sharing what God has done in your life. A good example of this is the Samaritan woman at the well. She encounters Jesus. She marvels at what Jesus says to her, and what does she do? She goes and tells all the people in her town, hey, here's this man that I met. Here's this man. Listen to what he said. This is what an experiential approach to apologetics typically does. It takes what experiences we've had, and it shares them with others. And all of these approaches are good and proper approaches to take in doing apologetics. But there's another approach to apologetics, which I just call a person-centered approach. These approaches over here are content-oriented. So you're offering evidences, or you're offering arguments against competing belief systems, or you're even sharing your experience. Over here, though, our focus takes its cues from the person that we're talking to. And so a person-oriented approach, I think, is a very effective approach, and in many cases, more effective than a content-based approach. And I just want to give you a few different hints, suggestions in how to go about a person-oriented apologetic. So here's my first suggestion. My first suggestion is, I'm just going to put it this way, listen. And what I mean by listen is this. Not everyone is a skeptic of God or a skeptic of Jesus for the same reason, okay? Some people don't believe in God for purely intellectual reasons. So they have intellectual hang-ups about believing in God. I think those people are few and far in between, though. In many other cases, it's not just an intellectual issue, it's an emotional issue. So maybe they've been hurt somewhere in their life. Maybe they've been hurt by Christians or by the church. Or maybe they experienced loss or suffering in their life and they prayed to God and they didn't feel like God answered their prayers. And so they chose to reject God in that moment. So for them, disbelief isn't purely intellectual. It's also what? It's also more deep. It's deeper than that. It's emotional. Some people don't believe for purely volitional reasons. They don't believe in God because, frankly, they don't want to submit their lives to anyone else, but especially a God. And so they have volitional reasons for disbelieving in God. It's not purely intellectual. It's more an issue of the will. And Jesus told us that would be the case for many people, that they're just not willing to count the cost of discipleship. And so what I'm getting at here is, if someone asks you, hey, why are you a Christian? Why do you believe what you believe? They're not necessarily asking you to launch into some sort of intellectual argument. It might be more appropriate to hit the pause button and ask the person, can you tell me your story? Can you tell me your story of disbelief, your story of skepticism? So why do you have a problem believing in God? Is there anything from your background that led you to this point? Because if you're just offering intellectual arguments to a person that really they don't believe in God for emotional reasons, then you could offer all the intellectual reasons in the world and it's not going to make any impact on them because you haven't addressed the deeper heart issue. And so my first piece of advice to you is, again, listen to the specific reasons why a person doesn't believe. And that might involve asking them questions. Tell me your story. Tell me your background. Tell me your experience with the church. Tell me your experience with God. And it's only once you have that conversation that you can have a more fruitful conversation about why you believe what you believe. Here's my second piece of advice. Ask good questions. So sometimes the best answer for a question is another question. So some of my favorite questions to ask skeptics are questions like, why do you say that? What led you to say that? What assumptions are you making when you ask that question? So what I want to do is I want to turn the tables a little bit on a skeptic, and I want them to explain to me the justification for their question. Where is that question coming from? What assumptions are you making when you ask that question? Another question I like to ask is, can you tell me what you believe? As a Christian, I'm not the only one here who believes things. So you're asking me why I believe what I believe. Can you just take a moment and tell me why you believe what you believe? Tell me why you don't believe in God. What led you to this point? Another question I like to ask is, what do you think I'm going to say? So when a skeptic asks me a question, a lot of times they've already formulated what they think you're going to say as a Christian. And so I like to just kind of get that on the table. So you're asking me a question, why do I believe in God? You tell me why you think I believe in God. Or you ask me why I believe in Jesus raising from the dead. Well, you tell me, what do you think I'm going to say? And sometimes I can get a skeptic to kind of have a conversation with themselves where they're asking and answering their own questions. Another question that I like to ask is, are you sure about that? Are you definitely sure about that? In apologetics, I like to talk in terms of putting pebbles in shoes. And, we've all had that experience of walking along and all of a sudden we get a small little rock in our shoe and it just ruins our walk, right? It's just annoying. And we can't think of anything else other than getting that rock out of our shoe. And so sometimes in apologetics, I have to realize it's not on me to necessarily change this person's mind. Okay. I think that's a work of God and the Holy Spirit, to be working on this individual, to change their mind, to change their heart ultimately. So my goal in apologetics is actually, it's a lower goal than that. I just want to make them uncomfortable with their disbelief. I want to make them uncomfortable with their skepticism. And so I call that putting a little rock in their shoe, putting a little pebble in their shoe, something that annoys them. And so by asking a good question, like, are you sure about that? Have you actually studied that? Have you actually learned about that? How did you become convinced of that? Asking these questions can really put a shadow of doubt in the skeptic's mind. I always tell skeptics, one of my favorite things to tell them is, I don't mind you being skeptical. I just want you to be skeptical about your own skepticism. So ask questions of your questions. So listen, also ask good questions. Thirdly, agree until you have to disagree. Agree until you have to disagree. Here's what I mean by this. When you're doing apologetics, you don't have to defend every square inch of the field, okay? Not every single thing is a life or death issue that you have to defend. Not every single question has a nice, easy answer to it. And so one of the things that I like to do with a skeptic is I like to surprise them by agreeing with them. I'm going to agree with them until I have to disagree with them. So if they say, well, I struggle with the idea of Jesus raising from the dead, one of the things that I'll do is, you know what? I get that. I understand that. That makes sense to me that you would struggle with that, because the idea of a person raising from the dead, that's a difficult thing to believe, right? And so I'm not going to immediately start in on them, showing them why they're wrong. I want to actually agree with some of their skepticism. I understand where you're coming from. And if I can, I want to lead them towards those things that ultimately matter, the questions that are of utmost importance. I don't want to spend all my time with a skeptic trying to answer questions that are really just around the periphery of what I believe. I want to, if I can, I want to answer those questions that are at the very heart of what I believe, the essentials of what I believe. I don't want to get distracted by all sorts of, because that's what a skeptic will often do. A skeptic will often nibble around at the periphery of your faith. It'll nibble around at the edges of your faith. But instead, I want to focus on what I call bullseye beliefs, those things that are at the absolute center of what I believe. Here's the next thing. Be a good friend. Okay? Don't be a debate partner. Don't be a sparring partner. Be a good friend. When someone tells you, a friend or a family member, when they tell you, I'm struggling with faith. I don't believe in God. I have all these questions about who God is and what God's all about. They're not necessarily asking you for a fight. They're really saying, I need a good friend. I need someone to listen to me. I need someone to love me. I need someone to be invested in my life. So the first thing that I would tell you is, instead of launching into a debate, be a good friend. And good friends do things like listen and ask good questions. Here's the next thing. Use your brain. Use your brain. Paul tells us in 2 Corinthians 10, he says, take every thought captive. Take every thought captive. And in doing apologetics, in a person-based approach to apologetics, we have to be critically examining, critically thinking about not just our own faith, but we have to be thinking about the type of questions that the skeptic is asking. So we have to think about, what are their assumptions? What assumptions are they making? What are their goals? What are their ambitions? Like we have to actually think through the questions that a skeptic asks. And then lastly, don't forget the goal. The goal of apologetics is not to win an argument. Sometimes we miss that. Sometimes we forget that. Sometimes we think that in apologetics, we just want to score some points. We want to score some debate points. And I fall into that trap just like anybody else does, because we so desperately want to show the world that we're right and they're wrong. But that's not the goal of apologetics, because that's not the goal of discipleship. Jesus tells us to go into the world and not win debates. That's not what Jesus says. He says, go into all the world and what? Make disciples. And so our goal is not to, at the end of the day, say, you know what, I showed that skeptic who was boss. I showed that skeptic what the truth really was. No, you probably didn't show him anything other than, another Christian who's unwilling to listen. What you really want at the end of the day is not to win a debate. What you want is to win a disciple. And I think that a person-oriented approach has to always remember that, has to always remember what the goal is. So again, how do I do apologetics? There's a lot of different ways to do apologetics. There are content-based approaches which have their place and have their purpose and can be very helpful and effective. But I think that a person-based approach, ultimately at the end of the day, is a much more effective approach to apologetics.